The first thing anyone in Caldera Springs told Inez Holloway when she stepped off the stagecoach was not where to find a room, not where to buy a warm meal, and not where to stable her horse. It was a warning about Matthew Boone. She had barely steadied herself on the wooden platform, brushing the red dust of the Texas panhandle from her skirt, when old Delia Marsh, who ran the post office out of the front room of her house and seemed to know everything about everyone within a 40-mile radius, pressed her wrinkled hand to Inez's forearm and leaned in close enough that Inez could smell the dried lavender tucked into her collar. "You're the new schoolteacher," Delia said. "It's not a question." "Inez Holloway," Inez confirmed, holding out her hand properly. Delia ignored the hand and instead gripped her arm tighter. "You'll be boarding with us for a spell until the schoolhouse is sorted. And I'll tell you plain because no one else around here will think to. You stay clear of Matthew Boone." Inez looked out at the town spread before her. It was November of 1882, and the sky over Caldera Springs was the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of an early freeze. The main street was a single wide strip of packed earth flanked by a hardware store, a dry goods, a saloon with a cracked painted sign, a barber shop, a blacksmith's, and a church at the far end that looked like it had been assembled in some haste and repented of nothing. A few horses stood tied to rails, their breath rising in white plumes. A man in a canvas duster walked across the street without looking up. The town was modest in every way, and yet Inez had come here on purpose. She had chosen it off a map with her finger and written to the county seat, and she intended to stay. "Who is Matthew Boone?" she asked. Delia released her arm and straightened as though she had just done Inez the greatest favor of her life. "He owns the Broken Spur ranch, 7 miles south, biggest spread in the county. He's 31 years old and has not spoken a civil word to another human being in going on 4 years. She paused for effect. "Cold, unreachable, that's what they call him. The children in town are afraid of him. Even Sheriff Landon gives him a wide berth." Inez picked up her traveling bag and her smaller case of books. "What happened 4 years ago?" Delia's expression shifted into something between pity and theatrical sorrow. "His wife passed, fever. Then 6 months after, his little boy, same fever. They say he closed up after that like a winter creek, froze solid and hasn't thawed since." Inez said nothing for a moment. She looked down the main street again, then back at Delia. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and she meant it honestly, without any particular judgment in her voice. She followed Delia toward the post office house, and she did not think again about Matthew Boone for the rest of that day, because she had rooms to settle, a stove to learn, and 23 children enrolled for school beginning Monday morning. She thought about him on Tuesday. That was the day young Caleb Dunmore, who was 9 years old and inclined toward chaos, threw a primer across the schoolroom and caught his boot on the bench on his way to the corner Inez had sent him to, and tumbled headlong into the wall hard enough to split his lip. It was not serious, but it was dramatic, and blood on a child's face had a way of clearing a room of reason. Inez cleaned the cut herself with clean water and a cloth, settled Caleb with a piece of butterscotch she kept in her desk drawer for exactly such emergencies, and then walked him home at the end of the day because his mother had not come to collect him. The Dunmore farm was on the South Road, and it was past the fork that led, according to the painted board nailed to a fence post, to Boone's Broken Spur. She did not take that road. She brought Caleb to his mother, a tired woman named Ruth, who thanked her with watery eyes and offered her a jar of preserved peaches, which Inez accepted because she understood the gesture. On her walk back, the wind had come up from the north and cut through her coat like it had a purpose, and she moved quickly along the road, pulling her collar up. She saw him then for the first time. He was riding in from the south, alone, on a dark bay horse that moved with the unhurried confidence of a horse that had never been asked to rush. The man was tall in the saddle, not in any theatrical, storybook way, but in the way of a man who had spent so many years on horseback that riding was simply how his body preferred to exist. He wore a heavy duster the color of old tobacco, and his hat was pulled low against the wind. As he drew closer on the road, Inez stepped to the side to let him pass. She glanced up. He did not look at her. He rode past without a turn of the head, without a nod, without any acknowledgement at all that she was a living human being standing 3 feet from his horse in the cold. His jaw was set, and his eyes were fixed somewhere on the middle distance beyond the town. His face, what she could see of it beneath the hat brim, was angular and weathered, not unhandsome, but set into a kind of deliberate blankness that was more arresting than anger would have been. Anger meant you cared about something. This was different. This was a man who had decided, quite firmly, that the world was not a thing he needed to engage with. Inez watched him ride on for a moment, then turned and walked back to town. Cold, she thought. Delia was not wrong about that. The first week settled into a rhythm. Inez was, as it turned out, a very good teacher. She had grown up in Galveston, the daughter of a schoolmaster, and she had been educated in a way that was unusual for a woman of her era, thoroughly, seriously, with genuine expectation that she would use it. When her father died, when she was 26, and the school where he had taught hired a man from San Antonio without considering her for half a moment, she had packed her books and her grief together into the same trunks and set out to find somewhere that needed what she could give. Caldera Springs needed it badly. By the end of that first week, she had organized the students by reading level rather than age, convinced the county to send 2 additional primers, persuaded Hector Villanueva at the dry goods to donate a box of chalk in exchange for a proper letter of gratitude she wrote on school stationery, and established that Wednesday afternoons would include an hour of practical arithmetic using real measurements and real money. Because she was a woman who believed in education that was useful as well as beautiful, she also learned the town's rhythms. Saturdays, most of the ranchers came in for supplies. The Caldera Springs Saloon, which was called the Amber Rail, did its best business Saturday evenings. The church on Sunday was attended by perhaps half the town, and Reverend Mills preached with more conviction than precision. The sheriff, a laconic man named Percy Landon, did his rounds twice daily and was generally liked, which in a town this size meant he was probably doing his job adequately. And Matthew Boone came to town roughly once every 2 weeks for supplies at the dry goods, said nothing to anyone beyond what was necessary to complete his transactions, and left. She witnessed this the second Saturday of November. She was at Villanueva's picking up a spool of thread when the door opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and she turned to see him. He was broader through the shoulders than she had realized from her single roadside glimpse. He moved through the store with the efficiency of a man who had written a list, intended to follow it, and had absolutely no interest in deviating. Hector greeted him with careful warmth and received a single nod. A woman near the flour barrel found somewhere else to be quite suddenly. 2 men who had been talking by the door went quiet and waited until Boone had passed before resuming their conversation at a lower volume. Inez watched this with genuine curiosity. She was not afraid of him. She recognized that she perhaps should have been, given the unanimity of the town's opinion, but fear had never been her first instinct in the face of an unknown thing. Curiosity was. It was, her father had always said, her best quality and her most inconvenient one. She finished selecting her thread and brought it to the counter. Boone was at the far end, working through his list with Hector, who was pulling items from shelves with the focused energy of a man determined to make himself indispensable. Inez set her coins on the counter and waited for Hector's assistant, a boy named Pete, to wrap the thread. "You're the new schoolteacher," said a voice. Low, flat. She turned. Matthew Boone was looking at her, not past her, not through her, at her. His eyes were dark gray, the color of a winter sky before the snow actually commits to falling, and they were, she thought, the eyes of a man who had not looked at another person directly in quite a long time, because he was doing it now with the slightly cautious quality of someone attempting an unfamiliar skill. "Inez Holloway," she said, and she did not hesitate, and she held out her hand. A beat. He looked at the hand, then he shook it. His grip was brief and firm. "Boone," he said. "I know," she said pleasantly. "You own the Broken Spur." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, not quite displeasure, something between the two that was too complicated to name quickly. "Word travels," he said. "Small town," she agreed. She picked up her wrapped thread and tucked it into her basket. "Good afternoon, Mr. Boone." She left. She did not look back. She could feel his gaze on her back for approximately 6 steps, and then it stopped, and she heard the low sound of his voice resuming conversation with Hector. She walked back to the post office house where Delia was waiting with coffee and bread, and the relentless hunger of a woman who wanted an account of everything. And Inez gave her a cheerful report of the thread and the chalk, and said nothing about Matthew Boone at all. 2 days later, one of Inez's students did not come to school. His name was Thomas Alcott, and he was 11, and he was one of her best readers. She had noticed from the first day that he had the particular quality of a child who was bright, and had been around adults long enough that he carried a kind of steady, watchful intelligence that was more developed than his years suggested. He lived, she had learned, at the Broken Spur. He was the son of Boone's foreman, Frank Alcott, and his wife Clara, who had 3 other children and worked the house alongside her ranch duties. When Thomas missed Monday and then Tuesday, Inez sent a note home with one of the other children who lived along the South Road. On Wednesday morning she received a reply, written in a careful but untrained hand, from Clara Alcott, explaining that Thomas had a bad cough and a fever that had come on Sunday, and she was keeping him in until it passed. Fever. The word sat differently in Inez's mind, given what she knew about the Broken Spur. She told herself it was simply practical concern for a student. She packed her satchel on Wednesday afternoon, after school let out, with 2 of Thomas's favorite books that she had promised to loan him, and she walked the 7 miles to the Broken Spur because there was no other way for her to get there, and the cold did not bother her as much as people seemed to expect it to. The ranch materialized as she came over a low rise, and it was not what she had imagined. She had built up in her mind the sort of place that matched the man's reputation: stark, bare, stripped of any softness. Instead, it was a working ranch of genuine scale, with a solid main house built from limestone and timber, a barn twice the size of the schoolhouse, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, a windmill turning slowly in the stiff November wind, and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. It looked, she thought, like a place that had once been deeply cared for and was still being maintained carefully, out of something that might have been habit or might have been a kind of stubborn faithfulness to its original purpose. Clara Alcott met her at the door of the foreman's cottage, a separate structure from the main house, tidy and warm, and was surprised and immediately grateful. Thomas was sitting up in bed, not as poorly as she had feared, with the hectic brightness in his eyes of a child who had been feverish for days but was now on the mend. He lit up when he saw the books, and Inez sat with him for half an hour, reading the first chapter of one aloud and making him laugh with the voices she gave the characters. And then she looked at the small clock on the dresser and realized the afternoon had gone faster than she intended. She stepped out into the gathering cold and saw that the light was already shifting toward the gray-orange of very early dusk. 7 miles back to town, she calculated. She had made it here in a brisk 2 hours. If she started now, she would arrive at full dark, which was not ideal but manageable. She pulled on her gloves and turned toward the ranch road. "That road is 12 miles back to town," said a voice behind her. She turned. Matthew Boone was standing at the corner of the barn, a bridle in his hands, his duster open at the front. He had been, she guessed, working with one of the horses. His expression was its usual arrangement of nothing in particular, but he was looking at her with that same direct, cautious attention she had noticed in the dry goods. "I came the South Road," she said. It's 7 miles. South Road bends around the ridge past the creek crossing, he said. Creeks run high from last week's rain. You came over the ridge, you'll find the crossings out and you'll have to backtrack to the main road. Adds 5 miles. She considered this. She did not have the luxury of being proud about it. Is there another way? He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard and the horses in the nearest corral shifted. Then he said, I'll drive you. That is not necessary, she began. It is getting dark, he said, with the tone of a man who was not going to argue but was also not going to change his position. He did not say anything else. He turned and went into the barn. Inez stood in the yard for a moment, then adjusted her satchel on her shoulder and followed. The wagon was a flat buckboard, practical and well kept, pulled by a pair of matched roans that he hitched with quick, certain movements that spoke of 10,000 repetitions. He did not offer to help her up. He climbed to his side, took the reins, and waited. She climbed up herself, settled her skirt, and set her satchel on her lap. They drove in silence for a quarter mile. Thomas is doing better, she said. I know, he said. He kept his eyes on the road. He's a very good reader for his age, one of the best I've had. Another quarter mile of silence. Then, his father reads to him, always has. It shows, she said, and she meant it. The sky was darkening fast. The road cut through open rangeland, the grasses bent flat by the wind, and the low hills to the west were dark outlines against a pale sky. It was beautiful in a stark, unsentimental way, and Inez thought that the land out here did not care about you in the slightest, which was, paradoxically, part of its appeal. It was honest. You walked 7 miles, he said. I did. From town. That is generally where I live, yes. A pause. For a student you've known 3 weeks. For a student who is sick and lives far from town and whose teacher made a promise about books, she said. He said nothing to that. She noticed that the silence with him was not hostile. It was more like the silence of a man who was deeply unaccustomed to having conversations that moved in any direction other than the practical, and who was finding this mildly disorienting. They reached the edge of town in what she calculated was 40 minutes, considerably faster than walking. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the end of the main street, across from the post office house, and she climbed down before he could decide whether to offer help. Thank you, she said, looking up at him. I appreciate it, Mr. Boone. He looked at her for a moment from the wagon seat. The lamplight from the post office window caught the edge of his face, and she could see the tiredness in it, not physical tiredness, the kind that sleep fixed, but the deeper kind that lived in a person's whole way of being. Don't walk the South Road alone after November, he said. Weather turns without warning. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He turned the wagon and drove back south without another word, and she stood on the street for a moment watching the wagon until the darkness took it, and then she went inside to Delia's coffee and said nothing about that either. Delia noticed anyway. Delia had seen the wagon from the window. That was Matthew Boone's rig, she said, setting the coffee down with the precision of a woman who was not going to make a fuss but was absolutely going to make a fuss. He gave me a ride from the ranch. The creek crossing on the South Road is out, Inez said. You walked to the Broken Spur. Thomas Alcott has been ill and I promised him books. Delia looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman updating several files in her mental cabinet. He gave you a ride, she said again. He did. He doesn't give anybody rides, Inez. Well, said Inez, reaching for the coffee, perhaps the creek being out made it practical. She did not think it was only the creek. But she kept that to herself. The next Saturday, Boone came into the dry goods at his usual time, and Inez happened to be there again, because she was developing the habit of doing her weekly errands on Saturday mornings, and because Villanuva's was simply where errands happened in Caldera Springs. She was examining a bolt of dark blue wool fabric. She had a hole in the left elbow of her good coat and needed to make a patch, when she heard the door and felt the shift in the room's social atmosphere. She did not turn immediately. She selected her fabric, brought it to the counter, and while Pete was cutting and wrapping it, she became aware that Boone was standing a few feet away, waiting for Hector, who was helping someone else. Good morning, she said, without making a production of it. "Morning," he said. "The South Road crossing hasn't been repaired, partially," he said. "Still not safe for another week." "Good to know," she said. "Thomas came back to school Wednesday. He gave an excellent account of the books." Something happened in his expression. It was subtle, barely more than a slight shift around the eyes, but it was there, and she thought it was something very close to being pleased. "He's a good boy," he said. "He's also very fond of you," she said. "He mentioned Mr. Boone 3 times in the space of one story about a horse." This time she was certain she saw it. The very faintest change in the corners of his mouth, not a smile, not yet, but the structural memory of one, like a house that had once been bright and still held the shape of its windows even in the dark. He said nothing, but he did not leave either, which was, she thought, its own kind of communication. Hector arrived to take his order, and the moment dissolved. Inez gathered her fabric, said good day in general to the room, and went out into the cold, bright Saturday air. She was sitting on Delia's porch that afternoon, grading arithmetic slates. She had tried to explain to Delia that she sometimes needed to work out of doors, and Delia had accepted this as the harmless eccentricity of an educated woman, when she heard horse hooves on the street and looked up to see Boone's dark bay passing by. He was heading back south. He had his supplies. His hat was pulled low. He slowed very slightly in front of the post office house. He did not stop. He did not look toward her, but he slowed, and then the bay picked up its pace again and carried him out of sight. Delia was inside making supper. She had not seen. Inez looked down at the arithmetic slate in her lap and said nothing at all to herself about it. But she was smiling, just slightly, at the addition problem in front of her, which had nothing whatsoever to do with arithmetic. November deepened. The nights turned genuinely cold, the kind of cold that was not asking permission. The water in the basin in Inez's room had a thin skin of ice on it 3 mornings in a row. The children came to school bundled like small, enthusiastic parcels, and the schoolhouse stove, which had a temperament, became Inez's daily antagonist. She learned to read it the way she had learned to read her more difficult students, where its resistance actually lived, how to coax it into cooperation. She also became a fixture in Caldera Springs in the way that a good teacher does, not by inserting herself into the community's business, but by being consistently, quietly useful, until the community grew around her like a structure around a solid post. She organized a reading evening at the church on Fridays. Adults welcome, children welcome, anyone who wanted to hear a chapter of a novel read aloud. She wrote letters for Mrs. Garza, who was from Chihuahua and whose English was adequate for daily life, but not for the formal correspondence she needed with the land office regarding her late husband's property. She sat with old Jonas Pembroke when his chest was bad and read to him until he slept. She was, at 28, already a person of some substance. And she thought about Matthew Boone in the way you thought about a puzzle that was not your responsibility to solve, but that you kept picking up anyway, because there was something in its shape that asked to be understood. She thought about his wife and his son, about the 4 years of cold, about the way he had looked at her in the dry goods, not with the wariness the town extended to him, but with a kind of unguarded assessment that suggested he had not yet decided what she was and was being careful about it, about the way the wagon had slowed in front of the post office house. She was thinking about him when Thomas Alcott arrived at school on a Thursday morning with a note from his mother asking if Miss Holloway might come to supper on Friday evening, as the family would be grateful for the company, and Thomas had not stopped talking about her. She wrote back yes. Frank Alcott collected her at the end of Friday's school day in a wagon, because the South Road crossing was still not fully repaired, and she found the foreman's cottage full of good smells and warm noise, 3 younger children underfoot, Clara stirring a pot with one hand and setting a table with the other, Frank talking about the cattle prices with the specific complaint of a man who believed strongly in the right to air grievances while still getting on with the work. It was a good evening. Thomas showed her his progress on a letter he was writing. his hand improving from the large, looping strokes of a child to something more deliberate and formed. Inez helped the second youngest with a knot she had tied herself into with some yarn, and was helping Clara with the dishes when the knock came at the cottage door. Frank answered it. She heard him say, "Evening, Mr. Boone," with the particular mix of respect and warmth that a good foreman used with a decent employer. Clara glanced at Inez with an expression of absolute neutrality that was clearly containing something else. Boone stepped inside. He was in his coat, without the duster, which gave him a slightly different look, less the range figure, more just a man. He had a jar of something in his hand, which he offered to Clara without ceremony. "Honey from Perkins over the East Ridge," he said. "His wife sent it." "That's very kind," Clara said, taking it. "Will you stay for coffee, Mr. Boone?" The pause was just long enough to be noticeable. His eyes had moved to Inez, standing at the dish basin with her sleeves rolled up and a cloth over her shoulder. "A cup," he said. He sat at the table. Thomas immediately moved his chair closer and began talking about a horse in the East Corral that had a peculiar habit of stepping sideways before a jump. And Boone listened to this with the focused attention he seemed to give to things that interested him, which she noted were generally things that involved animals and children. He asked Thomas questions, real ones, not the placating, half-attending questions of adults who were performing interest, but actual questions that pushed Thomas to think more carefully and be more precise. He was, Inez thought, watching him from the corner of her eye while she finished the dishes, very good with children. Or rather, he was very good with this child, and she suspected the same would be true of any child who was not afraid of him, because what he offered was the thing good children wanted most, the genuine attention of an adult who thought their ideas mattered. Coffee was poured. Inez sat across the table from him because there was nowhere else to sit and she was not going to stand in the corner. Frank and Clara were managing the younger children's bedtime negotiation, which left a gap in the table conversation, and it was Inez who filled it. "Do you read, Mr. Boone?" she asked. He looked up. "Some," he said. "What?" He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give most things. "Range reports, cattle records," a pause. "Used to read more." "What did you read?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "History," he said after a moment. "History of the land mainly, and some poetry." This surprised her enough that she could not entirely conceal it. He noticed. "It surprises you," he said. It was not quite an accusation, more of an observation. "A little," she admitted. "What poetry?" "Whitman," he said. "Some Tennyson." Then with the briefest glance away and back, "My wife liked Tennyson." The name of the fact wife sat between them. She did not step away from it or redirect the conversation the way she suspected most people did. She had good taste, Inez said. He looked at her steadily. "She did," he said. "What was her name?" Inez asked. The question landed with a weight she had not predicted. Not because it was cruel, it was not, but because the answer, she could see, was something he had not been asked in a very long time. "Ellen," he said. "Ellen," she repeated carefully and nodded. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. From the back of the cottage she could hear Clara singing something low and tuneless to the youngest child. "The boy?" she asked just as quietly. She would not pretend he hadn't existed. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were several degrees warmer than they had been when she had first seen him, and he said, "James, he was 4. "I'm sorry," she said, not lavishly. Not with the overflowing apology people sometimes produced because they didn't know what else to do. Just the 2 words said honestly. He looked back at his coffee. "It was a long time ago," he said, in the voice of a man who said this frequently, and believed it less each time he said it. Frank came back to the table then, and the conversation moved on to the east fence line that needed repair before the hard freeze. And Boone finished his coffee and rose, and said his good nights with the particular economy of a man who had said more in the last 20 minutes than he had planned to, and was not yet sure how he felt about it. At the door he paused and looked back at Inez. "I'll drive you back to town," he said. "Frank will," Clara began. "I'm going north past town anyway," Boone said. to check the fence on the upper pasture. Clara looked at Inez with the carefully managed expression of a woman exercising remarkable restraint. "Thank you," Inez said, and took her coat from the hook. The wagon ride back was in the dark this time, the stars overhead so thick and so close in the Texas night that they seemed almost too much, too extravagant, as though the sky had stopped exercising any judgment about how much beauty it was appropriate to display. They had gone perhaps a mile before she said, "You do not actually need to check the upper pasture fence tonight." A silence. Then, very quietly, something happened that changed everything. She heard it, felt it almost before she understood what it was, the low sound of Matthew Boone laughing. It was rusty with disuse, rough at the edges and brief, and it was the most startled and genuine sound she had heard from another human being in months. "No," he said, "I do not." She smiled in the dark. She did not make anything of it, did not press on it or examine it like a found coin. She simply let it exist. "The children are afraid of you," she said after a little while. Not unkindly, as a fact. "I know it," he said. "It would help if you spoke to them when you come to town. I don't have anything to say to children I don't know. You had plenty to say to Thomas tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas is different." "He's not particularly," she said gently. "You simply know him." The wagon rolled on. The cold was sharp and clean, and she could see her breath, and she had her hands deep in her coat pockets. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "No," she agreed. "Everyone is." "I noticed," she said. "I found it curious rather than instructive." He looked at her. The starlight was enough that she could see his face in profile, the set jaw, the straight nose, the heaviness around his eyes that was not fatigue but something more persistent. "Why?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Because fear travels by repetition," she said. Someone is afraid, they tell someone else, that person becomes afraid, and so on. But I hadn't met you. I didn't see the reason to borrow someone else's fear before I'd formed my own opinion. "And your opinion," he said. "I think you are a man who is in a great deal of pain," she said, "who has decided that the safest way to live with that pain is to keep every other living person at a distance where they cannot make it worse." The wagon stopped. She realized they were at the edge of town, in front of the post office house. She did not know exactly when they had arrived. He had pulled the reins without her noticing. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but it was not the careful blankness. Something in it was unsettled, like ground that has been too long frozen and is beginning in some deep place to shift. "That is a plain thing to say," he said. "You seem to prefer plain things," she said. He did not dispute this. She climbed down from the wagon, landing solid on the frozen ground. She looked up at him one more time. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Boone," she said. "Matthew," he said, and it came out as though it had surprised him to say it. She smiled. "Good night, Matthew," she said. She went inside. She did not look back again, but this time it was because she was smiling so freely that the cold air on her teeth was almost startling, and she did not want him to see it and misunderstand it. It was not triumph. It was something much simpler and much more frightening than triumph. Delia was already in bed. Inez sat at the table in the kitchen with a candle and her journal, and she wrote 3 pages in a hand that was slightly less steady than usual. And when she was done, she closed the journal and sat for a while in the warmth of the dying stove, and thought about the way a man's voice changed when he said his son's name. A week passed. Then another. November was almost gone, and the last week of it arrived with a cold that had committed. The ground began to harden in earnest, not the shallow freeze of early autumn nights that thawed by midday, but the real, deep freeze that started below the surface and worked its way up until the earth was as solid as clay brick. The water troughs needed breaking every morning. The schoolhouse stove's temperament became its own kind of project. Boone came to town on the second to last Saturday of November, and this time when he came into the dry goods and saw her, he said, "Good morning, Inez," before she could say anything, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and Hector nearly dropped a tin of coffee behind the counter. She said good morning back. asked him about the fence on the east pasture, which she had remembered from the conversation at the Alcott's cottage, and he told her it had been done the previous week, and then he asked whether Thomas's reading had progressed. They stood talking for 4 or 5 minutes, which was, she understood from the careful peripheral attention of every other person in the store, an absolute unprecedented event in the social history of Caldera Springs. When she left, she heard the murmuring begin before the door had fully closed. She did not mind. Let them murmur. She had spent her professional life in rooms where people underestimated her, and she had long since decided that other people's projections were their business and not hers. She was at the Friday reading evening at the church. They had moved indoors properly now, the cold having settled in for real reading aloud from a collection of short stories she had ordered through the mail. The church was warm with bodies and lamp light, the adults sitting in the pews and the children on cushions someone had brought and distributed on the floor. She was mid-sentence in a story about a man who discovered a well on his property that had no bottom, when the church door opened and cold air moved through the room and she looked up. Matthew Boone stood in the doorway. The room shifted. Children on the floor looked up. Adults in the pews went very still. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, and she could see him assessing the room with the expression of a man who was deeply uncertain about a decision he had just made. She said, without pausing in her posture or her calm, "Come in. We're just at the good part." And then she looked back at the page and continued reading. The tension in the room stretched for 3 full seconds, and then she heard the door close and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, and then the creak of a pew near the back. She read for another 40 minutes. When she looked up at the end, he was still there, seated in the very last pew with his hat on his knee, and he was listening with the same focused stillness he had given to Thomas's horse story. Afterward, while people filed out with the pleasant, loose conversation of an evening well spent, he waited. She straightened her books. Most people had gone before he came forward. "The well story," he said, "it doesn't have an ending." "No," she agreed. "The author leaves it open." He considered this. "That bothers me," he said. "It bothers most people," she said. "That's rather the point. We want things to have endings. We want them to resolve." He was very close now, close enough that she was aware of the height of him, the solidity. "And you," he said, "does it bother you?" She looked up at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things take longer to resolve than others, and that in the meantime you have to keep showing up to find out how the story ends." He held her gaze for a long moment. The lamp was burning low and the church smelled of candle wax and cold wool and the particular dry warmth of a room that had held a lot of people. Reverend Mills was somewhere behind the altar, making sounds of tidying. "I haven't been to town on a Friday evening in 4 years, Matthew said. "I know," she said. "I didn't plan to come tonight," he said. "I know that too," she said. He put his hat back on. She began putting on her coat. He reached out and held the collar while she settled it on her shoulders, a small, practical gesture, done without thought, the kind of thing that is instinctive when you are near someone and they need help with a coat. And when she turned to thank him, they were closer than either of them had calculated, and his eyes were a gray she was beginning to know as well as a specific kind of weather knows the sky it belongs to. "I will drive you home," he said. "Delia's house is 50 feet from the church door," she said. 50 cold feet, he said. She laughed. It surprised him, and then it changed his face. The way she was learning things changed his face gradually, not all at once, like a landscape coming into the light of dawn, one feature at a time. "All right," she said. 50 cold feet. He drove her those 50 feet in the buckboard, and it was the most unnecessary and most perfect ride she had ever taken in her life. And when she jumped down from the wagon and looked back up at him, she was very nearly certain that she was in love with Matthew Boone, which was inconvenient and wonderful, and exactly the sort of thing her father would have said was entirely consistent with her character. "Good night, Matthew," she said. "Good night, Inez," he said, and the way he said her name was different now from the first time in the dry goods, not practiced, not careful, but easy, as though it had settled into his vocabulary in the place where it had always been meant to go. December arrived and the ground froze properly. She had been in Caldera Springs exactly 1 month. She had been told by Delia Marsh, by several mothers who came to the schoolhouse to meet her, by Hector Villanueva, and by at least 3 people whose names she had not yet learned, that Matthew Boone was cold and unreachable. She had been told this as a warning, a fact, a piece of local knowledge as settled as the elevation of the land or the direction of the prevailing wind. She had listened to all of them, and she had gone ahead and reached him anyway, and now the ground was frozen and he was not, and she did not think either of them quite knew yet what had happened. What happened next was this: it snowed. The first snow of the season came on a Sunday night, quiet and relentless, and by Monday morning it had put 4 inches on the ground and was still going. Inez opened the schoolhouse and waited, and only 8 of her 23 students arrived, the ones who lived in town and could wade through the snow without a horse. She taught them anyway, because she was not a woman who closed for weather when weather could be managed, and they spent the morning on reading, and the afternoon building an elaborate map of the county out of flour paste and watercolor that took on a life of its own in a way that was, she privately admitted, much more interesting than the original lesson plan. On Tuesday the snow stopped and the sun came out and the whole world was sharp and white and almost too bright to look at directly, and Inez was crunching through it toward the dry goods when she heard the sound of a horse and looked up and saw Matthew coming into town at a pace that was faster than his usual. He spotted her and pulled up. "Are you free this afternoon?" he said without preamble. She looked up at him. His face was cold-reddened and he had a particular energy about him she had not seen before, not urgency exactly, but intention. "School ends at 3, she said. "I'll be here at 3, he said, and turned the horse and went to the dry goods with his list. At 3 o'clock, when the last student had gone out the door with a scarf wrapped to their eyes, he was there with the wagon. He helped her up this time, his hand at her elbow, brief and steady. He drove south past the edge of town, and then west on a track she had not taken before, and after about a mile he stopped the wagon at the crest of a low ridge. From there the valley spread out below them, and in the snow it was transformed, the rangeland white and smooth, the creek a dark thread through it, the Broken Spur buildings tiny in the south, smoke rising from their chimneys. The afternoon sun was already low, and it turned the snow to a field of hammered copper and the shadows to a deep blue that looked almost warm. She sat beside him on the wagon seat in the silence and the cold and the extraordinary light, and she did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. He had wanted to show her this. He had thought of it and come to find her and brought her here. That was its own whole sentence. After a while he said, "When the snow first came after Ellen died, I couldn't look at it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley. "It was the same winter," he said. "She died in November. The ground froze 2 weeks later." And it seemed he stopped. He was choosing words with great care, the way you chose footing on uncertain ground. It seemed like the land was agreeing with me, that everything should close up and go still. "And now," she said. He turned and looked at her. The copper light caught one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and he was, she thought, the most complicated and most honest face she had ever spent time looking at. "Now it looks like something that comes before a thaw," he said. She reached out and put her gloved hand over his gloved hand where it rested on his knee, and she left it there. He did not move. He looked down at their hands and then back at the valley. "I have been alone a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "I stopped," he paused. "I stopped thinking that would change. A lot of people told me you were cold and unreachable," she said quietly. "I was," he said simply and honestly. "They were not entirely wrong," she said. "You were very formidable when you rode past me on that road the day I arrived." He made a sound barely more than breath, but it was the laugh again, the rusty one. "You were not frightened." "No," she said. "I was curious." "Inez," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "I don't know what is happening," he said, and his voice had something in it she recognized from the edges of very deep water, a person who could see how far the surface was and was not certain they could reach it. "I think," she said carefully, that you are coming back." He looked at her. "Back from where you went after Ellen and James," she said. "I think you have been returning for a while now, and I think I perhaps arrived at a time when the door was slightly more open than it had been." He turned his hand under hers and held it. His grip was careful, as though he was holding something he was not entirely sure he had the right to hold. "I am not the same man I was before," he said. "I never knew that man," she said. "I know you." The sun was sinking fast now, the copper turning to red at the horizon. The cold had deepened. She could feel it through her coat. He squeezed her hand once, and then he picked up the reins with his other hand, because they needed to go before the dark came fully down, and they drove back to town in the fading light with their hands not touching any more but the warmth still present, a physical fact that had more substance to it than cold. At the post office house he helped her down from the wagon, and before she could step away he said her name. "Inez!" She turned. He was standing close. He reached up and with 2 fingers gently removed a small bit of snow that had caught in her hair, a gesture so simple and so careful that it made her throat ache. "Would you come to the ranch," he said, "for Sunday dinner, not the Alcott's cottage, the house?" He meant it as an invitation, but it came out slightly like a question he was not entirely sure he was allowed to ask. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He nodded, and something settled in his face, some held thing releasing. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she confirmed. He climbed back up to the wagon. He looked at her once more, and it was a look that had everything in it that he did not yet know how to say in words, and she looked back at him with everything she did know how to say but chose to wait on, because some things were worth waiting for the right moment. He drove away south and she stood on the frozen street and felt, for the first time in what might have been years, the particular joy of something beginning. The Sunday dinner was Frank Alcott's idea, but only partially. Inez understood this from the way Clara had laid the main house table, not the kitchen table but the long dining table that clearly had not been used in some time, the wood freshly polished, a cloth that was still pressed, and from the way Frank presented the idea of showing Inez the upper pasture after dinner as very natural, and then conveniently remembered a fence issue that required his attention in the opposite direction. She appreciated them both enormously. The main house of the Broken Spur was a revelation. She had expected it to be Spartan, cleared of anything personal, the way she would have expected from 4 years of a man alone in a grief that preferred blankness. Instead it was spare but not empty. There were books on a shelf by the fireplace, history books, as he had said, and a volume of Whitman with a worn spine and 3 others whose titles she could not read from across the room. There was a rug on the floor that was good quality, faded to a warmth. On the mantel there was a small framed daguerreotype. She looked at it while he was in the kitchen. A woman with light eyes and a composed expression holding an infant. Ellen. The boy she could only see from the side, a round cheek and a curl of dark hair against the woman's shoulder. She did not say anything about the photograph. She turned away from it when she heard him returning. He had cooked which she had not expected. It was plain cooking beef roasted with potatoes, cornbread, a jar of the Perkins honey on the table, but it was good, made with the care of a man who did not bother with things he did not intend to do properly. They sat across from each other at the long table that had been laid for 2. "You cook," she said. "I live alone," he said. "You learn or you starve." "When did you learn?" "Second winter," he said. He didn't need to specify which second winter. "What did you eat the first?" "Clara fed me," he said. "More than was her responsibility. I was not," he stopped. "I was not easy to feed. I didn't want to eat." "Of course you didn't," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You don't say that the way people usually say things like that," he said. "How do people usually say it?" "Like they're managing me," he said. "Like they're worried I'll break. You say it like it's simply true." "Because it is simply true," she said. "Grief affects appetite. It affects everything. That's not remarkable. It's just honest." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you grow up?" he said. She told him, Galveston, her father the schoolmaster. Her mother who had died when Inez was 12, of a tumor they couldn't treat, slowly and then quickly. Her father after that, who had been, she said, the best teacher she had ever known and who had educated her like it mattered, which it had. The years after his death, the school that hadn't hired her, the map on the table and the finger landing on the Texas panhandle. You chose here deliberately, he said. I chose to start over, she said. This is where starting over landed. Do you regret it, he said. She looked at him steadily. Not for a single moment, she said. He looked down at the table, and then back up at her, and what was in his face now was something she had not seen there before, something open, something that was about her specifically, about her presence at this table in this room that had been closed for 4 years. After dinner, she sat by the fire with the Whitman in her lap, and he sat in the chair across from her, and she read aloud, because she had asked, and he had said yes with the cautious willingness of someone who had forgotten the pleasure of a thing and was being gently reminded. She read for an hour. He listened with his eyes sometimes closed and sometimes on her, and the fire worked its way through the logs, and the house, which she had felt the weight of its silence in when she arrived, breathed differently now. When she rose to go, Frank was to drive her back. It was arranged. Matthew rose too and stood near the fire. Inez, he said. She turned. He crossed the room in a few steps and stood before her, and he reached out and took both her hands in his, and he held them with the same careful grip she remembered from the ridge in the snow. I would like to court you, he said, plainly, directly, with the straightforwardness of a man who had thought about this carefully and decided that there was no useful way to approach it other than honestly. She felt something warm move through her entire chest. Matthew, she said, I know I am not. He stopped. I have been away from this for a long time. I know I am not easy. I am told fairly regularly that I am difficult and cold and not fit for company. You are not cold, she said. You have been cold. There is a difference. You taught me the difference, he said, and the simplicity of that undid her slightly, the way a plain, true thing could do more than an elaborate one. Yes, she said, I will be courted by you, Matthew Boone. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had received something he had not been certain he would be given, and who did not entirely know what to do with the size of it yet. He raised her hands, both of them together, and pressed them briefly to his mouth. Not the back of her hand the way manners prescribed, but her hands as they were, folded in his, and it was the most genuine and least performative gesture she had ever received, and she thought that she was, without any remaining uncertainty, completely in love with this man. The courtship was, in the tradition of the time and place, a gradual and observable thing. People courted with chaperones and in public, and through the slow accumulation of time spent. What it meant in practice was that Matthew came to town more often, not dramatically, not overnight, but with increasing regularity, and when he came he spent some of that time with Inez, either at the dry goods or at the church reading evening on Fridays or occasionally at Delia's kitchen table, which became, over the course of December, an increasingly comfortable setting for the three of them. Delia having revised her estimate of Matthew Boone with remarkable swiftness once he had fixed her back porch step, which had been broken since September, without being asked. He had noticed it creaking when he brought Inez home one evening and come back the next morning with tools and wood. He fixed it without a word, Delia told anyone who would listen, in the hushed, wondering tone of someone reporting a miracle. Inez said nothing about it, but she thought about it for a long time. The porch step, the wordless fixing of a thing that needed fixing, because he was that kind of man, the kind who did not talk about what needed doing but simply did it. Christmas was coming, and with it the particular busyness of a small town that had real feeling for the season. The church was stringing greens. Children were learning a Christmas program that Inez had organized, which involved both a dramatic reading and a very ambitious attempt at two-part singing. Delia was preserving everything she could lay hands on, as though the calendar change would require supplies. Matthew came to the children's Christmas program. He sat in a pew 3 rows from the back. He had moved up from the last row. She noted and watched with the kind of attention he gave things he cared about. Thomas Alcott had a speaking role, 2 full sentences that he delivered with enormous dignity. And when Thomas finished and looked to the back of the room, he found Matthew Boone, and Matthew Boone gave him a single, slow nod that meant everything that was needed. Thomas beamed like a small sun. Inez saw this from the front of the room and pressed her lips together very firmly against whatever expression was trying to get out of her face. After the program, in the loose, warm noise of people collecting children and exchanging pleasantries, Matthew found her near the candles on the side table and stood beside her. "He was good," he said. "He practiced every day for 2 weeks," she said. "It showed," Matthew said. He was standing very close to her side, and she was aware of his warmth and of the way the candles on the table gave everything a softness that was different from daylight. She was aware of his hands beside hers on the table's edge, not touching but close. "Merry Christmas, Matthew," she said softly. He turned and looked at her. He had, she noticed, stopped guarding his expression when he looked at her at some point in the last several weeks. She could see what was in it clearly now, the depth of it, the steadiness, the thing that had been building in him since perhaps the dry goods, perhaps the wagon ride, perhaps the ridge in the snow, and had arrived now at something complete. "Merry Christmas, Inez," he said, and he covered her hand on the table with his and held it there, and they stood like that for a moment in the candlelight while the room moved around them, and several people noticed and said nothing about it in the moment and a great deal about it afterward. December turned toward its end, and the freeze deepened, and the world outside was all silence and white, and the particular blue cold of a Texas winter that doesn't apologize for itself. And inside that winter, 2 people were finding their way back to something, one of them back from a long distance, and one of them for the very first time, and neither of them was entirely certain of the difference. On the second to last evening of December, Matthew drove to Delia's house in the late afternoon with the buckboard and knocked at the door. Delia answered and called for Inez, and when Inez came to the door she found him holding the reins of the bay horse, not the wagon team, and standing in the last light of the afternoon with his hat in his hand. "Will you ride with me?" he said. She looked at the bay, then at him. "You have only 1 horse," she said. "It's a big horse," he said, and there was the faintest ghost of something in his expression that she was now very practiced at reading. She got her coat. She rode up in front of him on the bay, his arms around her on both sides of the reins, and they rode south along the road she knew so well now, and then across the open range where the snow was untouched, and the cold pressed in from all sides, but she was warm in the circle of him, and the horse moved beneath them with the steady patience of an animal that understood its work. The sun was nearly gone, and the first stars were appearing, and the land was absolutely still. They stopped at the ridge again. It was their ridge now, she thought, or it had become that quietly. He said nothing for a long time. She waited. She had learned that he needed the time, that the things he meant most deeply required the most time to come to surface, and that rushing them was pointless and also wasteful, like hurrying a river. "I want to ask you something," he said, and his voice was different, quieter, careful. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "here, at the Broken Spur, as my wife." The stars were out fully now. The world was made of cold and stillness and the sound of the horse breathing beneath them. "I have not always been," he stopped. "I am not an easy man, I know it. I have years on this they were dark years, and I know the shape of them left marks. I cannot promise to be simple or light, but I can promise you," his voice, which had been steady throughout, shifted. "I can promise you that I know what it costs to lose something, and I would not waste it." She turned to look at him, which was complicated on horseback, but she managed it. He was looking at her with everything in his face, the grief, the past, the 4 closed years, and overlaid on all of it something that was absolutely and unmistakably the future, wide open and afraid and real. "Matthew," she said. "I know it is fast," he said. 2 months, I know." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again, steadily looking at him. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he pressed his forehead briefly against her temple, and she felt him breathe, a long, deep breath out, as though he had been holding something for a very long time and had only now found the moment to let it go. His arms tightened slightly around her on the reins. "Yes," he said, as though he was hearing it again to make sure it was real. "Yes," she confirmed. They rode back in the dark, and the stars were out in their extravagant winter abundance, and Inez Holloway was going to be Inez Boone, and the ground was frozen solid, and Matthew Boone was not cold anymore, and neither of them said very much on the way home, because they were both very busy feeling the size of what had just happened. Delia cried when Inez told her that evening. She tried to pretend she was not crying and offered biscuits in compensation for the pretense, and Inez ate the biscuits and let Delia hold her hands and said that she would not be leaving Caldera Springs. She would be 7 miles south of it, and they would see each other regularly. "He is a good man," Delia said fiercely, as though defending a position she had somehow always held and was only now feeling free to state openly. "He has been a broken man, but he is a good one. Anyone with sense could see it. I said from the start, you told me to stay away from him," Inez said. Delia had the grace to look briefly uncertain. "I was protecting you," she said, until it was apparent protection wasn't needed. Inez laughed and hugged the old woman, who was small and fierce and smelled of dried lavender, and thought that the world was made of people like this. People who warned you away from good things out of fear, and then turned around and loved you for ignoring the warning. They were married on a Thursday in the second week of January 1883, at the Caldera Springs church with Reverend Mills officiating, and an attendance that was, by the count of the pews, approximately every adult in town plus 6 people from surrounding ranches who had heard and wanted to see it for themselves. The temperature outside was well below freezing. Inside the church, someone had brought a second iron stove from the saloon, which technically Mills had moral objections to, but the cold overrode theology on this particular morning. Inez wore her best dress, which was a dark green wool with a white collar, because it was January and she was a practical woman, and she had her hair up with 2 small silver combs that had been her mother's. Matthew wore his cleanest suit, which fit him well across the shoulders in the way that suits fitted by good material and work rather than a tailor did. He was composed, but his eyes, when she came down the aisle, which was short, the church being what it was, were not composed at all. They were the gray of winter sky giving way to light, and they were fixed on her with something that left no room for any other interpretation. She stood beside him and they faced Reverend Mills, and she was aware of the warmth of his arm against hers, and of how completely still he was, the way a man was still when he was paying the fullest possible attention. She said her vows clearly, looking at him, because she had always meant things directly. He said his slowly, in the low, careful voice of a man who chose every word with the knowledge of what words were worth, and when he said, "I will," it sounded like a thing that had been decided before he was asked. Thomas Alcott, sitting in the second pew with his family, cried without making any noise at all, which Frank Alcott pretended not to see, and Clara pretended not to see Frank pretending. After, there was food in the church hall that people had brought without being organized, because a town that had watched a good man come back from a long dark place deserved to feed itself in celebration. And there was coffee and pie, and someone had brought a fiddle. And in the lamplight of that January afternoon, the people of Caldera Springs were glad, in the way that small communities are glad when something that has long been wrong is set right. Sheriff Landon shook Matthew's hand and held it for an extra moment and said, "Good to have you back," in a voice that meant rather more than the words alone carried, and Matthew understood him and nodded once. Delia told everyone who would stand still for it that she had seen it coming from the very first day, which was not accurate but was not entirely false either, and nobody contradicted her because she was old and this was her moment and they all loved her. They drove to the Broken Spur that evening in the wagon, in the hard cold, and when the house came up over the ridge in the starlight, it looked different to Inez than it had the first time, not smaller, but warmer, as though the stones had absorbed something over the years that was only now showing. Matthew had put wood in the fireplaces before coming to the wedding. The main room was warm when they came in from the cold, and the fire was good, and on the mantel the daguerreotype of Ellen still sat, and Inez looked at it and then at him. "She stays," Inez said. It was not a question. He looked at her. "You're certain? She is part of who you are," she said. "She gave you James." "I would not have the man I married without everything that happened, and I won't pretend otherwise." She looked at the photograph again. "She is welcome in this house." He came to her then, and he held her, and it was the first time he had held her fully, not a hand, not a forearm, not the close proximity of a wagon seat, but his arms around her in the warmth of his own house, and she felt him sigh again, that same long, deep releasing breath. "What do I do," he said quietly into her hair, "when I don't know what I've been given?" "You keep it," she said. "You hold on to it and you let yourself know it over time." He held her tighter for a moment. "All right," he said, "I can do that." The winter broke in late February, which in the Texas Panhandle was not exactly spring. It was more like a negotiation between winter and spring that neither side fully won for another month, but the hard freeze gave way, and the ground softened, and the creek ran full and noisy with snowmelt. Inez had negotiated to continue teaching until the county could find a replacement, which took until mid-March, and she rode into town every weekday on a gentle sorrel mare Matthew had selected with care and pretended was for general ranch use while clearly choosing it for her specifically. She taught her last class on a Friday in mid-March, and she sat at the teacher's desk after the children had gone and looked at the room, the primer charts, the slates, the little stove she had learned to manage, the map of the county on the wall that she and her students had built from flour paste, and she felt the satisfying grief of endings, which was different from the other kind of grief. This was the kind that meant something had been real. Her replacement was a young man from Amarillo named Porter, 23, clearly nervous. She spent 2 days walking him through everything she had organized, introduced him to each family, showed him where the extra chalk was kept and how to coax the stove, and when she left for the last time she told him that Caleb Dunmore would test him in the first week and that butterscotch in the desk drawer was not optional. She walked out of the schoolhouse into the mild spring afternoon, and Matthew was there with the sorrel and his bay, waiting. "How was it?" he said. "Sad," she said honestly. "And good." He nodded. He understood endings that were sad and good. She mounted the sorrel, and they rode home side by side on the south road that she had walked so many times in the fall, and the land was showing the first green at the edges of things, and the sky above the flat country was enormous and clear, and it was the kind of afternoon that made the hardness of the country worth everything it cost. Spring at the Broken Spur taught her things. She had grown up in Galveston, near water, near a city. She knew the rhythms of a different kind of life. The ranch had its own rhythms, deeper and older, tied to the land and the animals in ways that she could only understand by living inside them. She learned to read the weather from the horses. She learned the smell of rain coming across the range. She learned that the land at dawn, when the light came across the flat from the east and caught the grass at a low angle, was worth getting up for before you were fully awake. Frank Alcott became something between a colleague and a friend, their relationship mediated by mutual respect for Matthew and by a shared humor that surfaced without effort. Clara became a genuine friend, the kind Inez had not had since Galveston, the kind where you could say what you actually thought and be understood. Thomas continued to be one of her great joys. He came to the house on Saturdays now, partly to see his foreman's daughter who was 12 and seemed to think reading was romantic in a way that made Thomas desperately overperform, and partly because he had established himself, without anyone quite marking the moment it happened, as something like a ward of the household. Matthew had been his father's employer and had watched him grow up, and it was a relationship that had, over the spring, opened into something more direct and more given. The way relationships could in the West, where survival had always been communal, even when people pretended to be independent. Matthew, she observed over the spring and summer and into the fall, was not becoming a different man. He was not becoming light or easy or the sort of person who made jokes freely and talked without thinking. He was becoming more himself, which was to say that the self that had been buried under 4 years of grief was surfacing, and it was a man of deep quiet feeling, of practical love, of humor that was dry and slow and 10 times funnier for being unexpected, of genuine regard for the people and animals in his care, and of a capacity for devotion that she thought had probably always been there, and had simply been directed now toward a new life instead of away from an ended one. He told her one summer evening on the porch that he had not known in November, when he had driven her home from the Alcott's cottage, what was happening to him. "You said so," she reminded him. "I meant it," he said. "I had no name for it. Something was different and I didn't understand the difference. The second time I drove you I was not afraid exactly. Something like afraid." "Of what?" He looked out at the land, the summer evening thick and warm around them. "Of wanting something again," he said. "I had stopped wanting. It was easier." She reached over and took his hand. His thumb moved over her knuckles in the steady way it always did when they sat like this. "I'm glad you were not too afraid," she said. "You didn't give me a great deal of time to be," he said. "You kept showing up." "I kept showing up," she agreed. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to it, not the back, as always her hand as a whole thing held. In September of 1883 she told him she was expecting. He went very still, the way he went still when something mattered beyond the reach of words. She watched him and waited. He looked at her, and she saw every layer of what it meant to him, the joy and the fear and the memory of James, 4 years old in a woman's arms in a daguerreotype. "Matthew," she said. He came to her and held her, and she felt him trembling slightly, which was the only time she had seen his body admit to feeling what his voice could not always say. "We're all right," she said into his shoulder. "We're going to be all right." He held on. "I know," he said, but he held on anyway, and she let him, because knowing and feeling were not always the same distance apart, and she understood that. The baby came in the spring of 1884, a boy. Matthew delivered him alongside the doctor, Dr. Greer, who had come from Amarillo, with the focused calm of a man who had spent his life bringing animals into the world, and who transferred that particular steadiness to the greatest moment of his life without quite knowing he was doing it. When the boy cried, that first bright, astonished cry of a new person announcing himself, Matthew Boone sat down on the edge of the bed, which was the first time in Inez's experience that he had sat down involuntarily, and he covered his face with his hands for a moment. She watched him. He looked up. His face was wet. He did not try to explain it or apologize for it. "He's all right," he said. "He's all right," the doctor confirmed. They named him William for Matthew's father, who had built the Broken Spur from nothing and died of old age and hard work, as Matthew put it, 2 years before Ellen. William Frank Boone, for Frank Alcott, who received this information with a handshake and then went around the barn to be alone for 5 minutes. Thomas Alcott held the baby with the enormous gravity of a 13-year-old who understood the weight of what he was holding, and looked at Matthew over the small head and said, "He's got your ears, Mr. Boone." Matthew looked at Inez, who bit her lip. "Don't tell him that," she said. Caldera Springs celebrated. Small towns had few enough occasions for uncomplicated joy that they made the most of each one. Mrs. Garza, whose land dispute Inez had helped resolve the previous winter and who had not forgotten, sent tamales. Delia brought preserved peaches, and a small blanket she had knitted in December in the careful way of a woman who has planned ahead. Reverend Mills came and said something that Inez found theologically imprecise but emotionally accurate, which was more or less all she expected. Matthew held William in the evenings by the fire with the particular stillness of a man who had learned, at great cost, how precious a held thing was. He did not hover or fret. He was simply present in the way he was present for the things he loved, completely without distraction. She watched him and thought of November, the stagecoach platform, the pewter sky, Delia's hand on her arm. He is cold, they said. Unreachable, they said. She had reached him before the ground froze. He had not known what was happening, and neither had she, fully, only that something in his shape asked to be understood, and something in her was not built to walk past a question she could actually answer. The years that followed were not simple. The ranch had hard seasons. A dry summer in 1886 that killed a portion of the cattle and required 3 months of brutal economies and renegotiated debts. A storm in 1887 that took the roof off the main barn and required the whole of the county's goodwill and labor to rebuild. A period in 1888 when Matthew's old grief surfaced, as old griefs will, in the specific way that joy sometimes did not prevent. It surfaced in 3 weeks of silence and distance that Inez recognized and did not fight but walked alongside until it passed, because she knew him. And she knew that this was weather, not a character change, and weather passed. When it passed, he came to her one morning while she was in the kitchen and sat down at the table and said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "I went away," he said. "You came back," she said. "You waited," he said. "Matthew," she said, setting down what she was doing and turning to look at him properly. "I am not going to leave. I need you to know that. Not because it is difficult or because the road is hard. I am here because here is where I chose to be, and I choose it every day. You do not need to earn it again every time the dark comes." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, and his eyes were the gray of winter sky giving way, which was the color she associated with him above all others. "I don't know how I managed before you," he said. "You barely did," she said kindly, and he made the rusty laugh. By 1889, William was 5 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's ready curiosity, and had established himself as a person of very strong opinions about horses, dogs, and the fairness of bedtime. He and Thomas Alcott, now 18 and working the ranch proper, had a relationship of affectionate exasperation that made the household considerably louder and funnier than it had ever been. And in the summer of 1889, Inez told Matthew she was expecting again. This time he did not go still. He lifted her off the ground, briefly and carefully, which was so entirely unlike his usual self that she laughed in pure surprise, and he set her down and looked slightly embarrassed about it, and she held his face in her hands and looked at him and said, "There you are." "Here I am," he said. The second child was a girl born in the spring of 1890. They named her Eleanor Ellen's name, at Matthew's quiet suggestion, which Inez had agreed to with a full heart, and Eleanor Boone arrived into the world with opinions of her own already visible, a fierce and immediate presence. And when Matthew held her for the first time and she opened her eyes and looked at him, something happened in his face that Inez had never seen before and was certain she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not the expression of a man who had been redeemed or rescued or saved. It was the expression of a man who had come back from somewhere very far and found that the distance had been worth the traveling, because what waited on the other end was more than he had known how to ask for. It was the expression of a man who was, completely and without reservation, home. The spring of 1890 was mild in the Texas Panhandle, the grasses coming in early, the creek running full and clear. Inez sat on the porch of the Broken Spur house one evening in late April with Eleanor on her lap and William asleep inside, and the sound of Matthew talking quietly to Frank somewhere by the barn, the low voices of men who understood each other's work and had long since become comfortable in each other's company. The land stretched out in every direction under a sky that was the particular pale blue of a spring evening that wasn't going to ask you to justify finding it beautiful. The windmill turned. The horses in the corral moved against each other in the easy way of animals that felt safe. There was smoke from the kitchen chimney and smoke from the Alcott's cottage, and the smell of the new grass that the whole previous winter had been building toward. Matthew came up from the barn and crossed the yard, and when he saw her on the porch, he stopped for a moment. She looked at him across the yard in the evening light. He was 40 years old, and the years of the range were in his face and in the set of his shoulders, and he was, she thought, as she had thought 1,000 times in the years between, the most honest-looking man she had ever seen. Nothing performed, nothing hidden that she had not been allowed to see, nothing held back from her that she had asked to know. He came up onto the porch and sat beside her, and Alina, at a few weeks old, made the small, interested sound of a baby who is awake and has decided she has opinions. Matthew reached over without ceremony and settled the baby against his chest, and Alina grabbed his finger in the blind, certain grip of infancy. "Thomas wants to put the new palomino on the east pasture," Matthew said, in the voice of a man who was already mostly asleep. "What do you think?" Inez said. "I think he's probably right," Matthew said. "He usually is. He will be insufferable if he hears you say that. Good thing I'm not saying it to him." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her. The evening light moved across the land in long amber bars, and the Broken Spur was a place where things grew and were cared for, and where grief had been allowed to exist and had been allowed to become something else, not erased but transformed. The way good land was not cleared of everything that had been there before but built upon, layer by layer, until it could hold more than it once had. She thought about November, about the stagecoach and the pewter sky and Delia's warning, about Matthew on the road not looking at her, about the first time he said her name, about the ridge in the snow and the stars and her hand in his. She thought about what Delia had said, cold, unreachable. She had reached him before the ground froze in that last open window of November, and he had not known what was happening, and neither had she, not entirely, only that something in him was worth the reaching for, and she had been right. She had been thoroughly, completely, permanently right. "Matthew," she said softly. He said, half asleep with his daughter on his chest and the evening coming down. "Are you happy?" A pause, long enough that she wondered if he'd gone all the way to sleep. Then his arm tightened around her. "I didn't know I was going to be," he said. "Not like this. I had stopped knowing that was a possibility." "I know," she said. "You gave it back," he said. "The knowing." She closed her eyes. The windmill turned. The grasses moved. The sky above the panhandle was going from blue to the first pale suggestion of a color that preceded stars, and it was enormous and honest and free, and underneath it the Broken Spur was warm and solid and full of the sound of ordinary, irreplaceable life. "You gave it back to yourself," she said. "I just showed up until you remembered you could." He was quiet for a long time. Then he pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held it there. Alina, on his chest, made a small sound of complete contentment, which was the sound of a person with no doubts about where she was and who was holding her. William slept inside with the deep, total sleep of a 5-year-old who had spent the day at full capacity and had no reserves left. Frank and Clara were in the cottage, their lamp making its warm square in the evening dark. Thomas was in the barn, likely still talking to the palomino. The Texas panhandle put its stars out, one by one and then all at once, in the way it always did, without modesty, without apology, the full extravagant inventory of the sky over the flat country, the kind of stars that made you feel very small and very held at the same time. Inez Boone, who had been told that the man beside her was cold and unreachable, who had reached him before the ground froze, who had watched him not know what was happening, and then slowly, stubbornly, honestly know it. She sat on her porch on a spring evening in 1890 with her husband's arm around her and her daughter in her husband's hands and her son asleep inside. And the land was green, and the stars were out, and the ground that had been frozen once was long since thawed and living. And she thought that this was the story she had chosen when she had put her finger on a map and decided to start over, and that it had turned out to be better than any story she could have written for herself, because she had not written it alone. She had written it with a man who said things plainly when he said them, who fixed porch steps without being asked, who read history and Whitman, and had said his son's name in a kitchen when someone finally thought to ask, who had driven 50 unnecessary feet in the dark and slowed a horse on an empty street, and come to a church on a Friday evening when he had not planned to, and said her name first in a dry goods store, and asked her to the ridge in the snow, and held her hands in a church where every person in town had come to see the thing that had been broken become whole. It had been the most important thing she had ever done, she thought, not the teaching, though she loved it, not the letter writing or the Friday readings or any of the other ways she had made herself useful. The most important thing had been simply that she had not been afraid of him, that she had looked at a man the whole town called cold and thought, "I have not met him yet." She had met him. And the rest, as it turned out, was a story that had no end worth noting, only days upon good days, adding themselves up in the way that love did when you let it, not dramatically, not all at once, but layer by layer, like good land, like spring coming after a long freeze, like a man who was not cold at all, who had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to show up before the ground closed over for good. The stars were fully out now. Matthew was asleep, she was nearly certain. She could hear his breathing, the slow and total sleep of a man at peace, and Alina was asleep on his chest, and the night was around them all, and it was warm. Inez stayed on the porch a while longer. She was in no hurry. She was, in every way that counted, exactly where she had intended to be.